Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We have a guest, a very special guest today. It's Dr. Doug Lisle. We're very excited to welcome him every second Thursday of the month, although this month is on the third Thursday. I'm Gustavo Tolosa, and today we are doing questions and answers based on last month's webinar that Dr. Lisle did, and many of you sent questions. And so today, what we're going to do is just go through the questions that you have sent. Unfortunately, today we will not be able to take questions from the chat box. You can type comments and chat among yourselves, but today we're confining the questions to the ones that have been emailed to us. You can still email questions at webinar@drmcdougall.com. Very good. That's all the announcements I have to make, and I want to welcome Dr. Doug Lisle. How are you doing today?
Good.
All right. Well, nice to see you, and we're just going to start. Everybody, I have to tell you, just really enjoyed the webinar that you did last month, and we want to encourage everybody to go back and watch it again because you gave us so much information there, and so we have questions now. Ready? Here we go. So the first question of the day is, what is the difference between binging, cramming, and bulimia?
Boy, I think they're interrelated. So a lot of people cram. In other words, most people cram, but most people are not binge eaters, and most people are not bulimic. So these are sort of different levels of an interrelated set of problems. We have to separate them out, though. It's meaningful to separate them out. Bulimia, obviously, people that suffer from this problem are in a bind where they've got enough anxiety about their weight that they wind up vomiting frequently after they have eaten. Now, sometimes this is going to be exacerbated by periods of deprivation beforehand, because they're trying to use their willpower to try to not eat at all or eat very little. And so what will happen is that they will get a ravenous hunger drive built up just from being sheer hungry and basically out of glycogen. And then what will happen is that they're very much drawn to rich foods. So it's not common for bulimics to be binging on carrots and grapes. What's going to happen is once they're hungry, they have a rather ravenous hunger drive, and once they've sort of stepped on their own neck for a while, for maybe 12 hours or whatever it is, so they're very hungry, and then they're drawn to the richest foods, as we all would be. And then what will happen is that they will eat very large amounts of those rich foods, which is easy to do in a short length of time when you're very hungry. And then behind their being upset with themselves about doing this, then they'll very often purge or they'll vomit. So that's a pattern that has definitely some similarities with cramming. So a lot of people that are cramming are doing something not completely different than what a bulimic is doing, but certainly quite a bit different. So cramming, I forget, you said two other things. There's cramming, binge eating. So binge eating is also, now this is looking pretty similar to bulimia. In other words, a lot of times binge eaters will eat a tremendous amount of food in a short length of time, and yet they won't purge. So it's kind of like bulimia without the purging at the other side. Binge eaters oftentimes will do exactly the same type of thing. In other words, they'll be very disciplined for a period of time beforehand, and they'll be very hungry. And then when they start to binge, they again are attracted to very rich foods because they're quite hungry, and then they can just eat a huge amount of food in a small length of time. So it's not uncommon for binge eaters to eat 3, 4, 5, 6,000 calories, even more in one stretch that might go on for an hour, might be half an hour, might be 2 hours. but this period of time is relatively short for the large amount of calories. The difference then is that a binge eater per se doesn't purge. That's not part of that habit. If they do, and they do it repetitively, then that's what we're going to call bulimia. So now, both of these things share characteristics with what I was talking about last time with the CramCircuit. Now, so it's useful to see that these are connected, because it can make a person who's suffering from bulimia or a person who is suffering from binge eating disorder understand that they're not that strange, not that weird, and they're not that far out of line. So these things don't have to be so deeply mysterious or connected with terrible prior events early in your history or anything of the kind. In fact, what they are is they're almost natural consequences of a few little variables being tweaked one way or the other. And so we begin the problem with the CramCircuit. So the CramCircuit is going to be, I mean, I just named this. Nobody's, I don't know. I'm sure there are some fancy descriptions of this that there's fancy descriptions of this that fit some scientific. We've got some Latin name for this somewhere. But the point is that it's what I'm calling this is an instinct inside an animal that has variable caloric density in its food supply, as opposed to an animal that has a mono diet that just simply eats one specific kind of food, and that specific kind of food would be low calorie density, so an animal that just eats grass. But if you have an animal that's an omnivore, or an animal that's a carnivore, or an animal with a varied diet, particularly people, which have the most varied diet of any animal on Earth, interestingly enough. So we have the widest palate of any animal on Earth. And as a result, we have the widest range of calorie density of the foods that we routinely eat. And so it would make sense that when we would run into the rich foods, which should be by definition almost the rarest food. So when we run into the rich food, of course, it would make sense that we would have an instinct that would say, go ahead and eat past normal satiety in these rare occasions when we're going to get our fingers and our mouths around some rich food. That is a CramCircuit and a Cram instinct. And so you can see that instinct let loose in the modern environment with you now surrounded by rich food, and the rich food being very cheap as opposed to nearly impossible to get the way it would have been in ancient times. You can see that this CramCircuit or this Cram instinct is now going to potentially run amok, and people are going to be indulging this thing routinely. And so now we set up the situation that we talked about last time, where actually a great many people, a very high percentage of people, are cramming on a daily basis. They're eating past normal satiety on rich foods only. They're not cramming apples and oranges at the end of their day. They're cramming the pizza that's left over, or they're craving ice cream. Now, the thing that I talked about last time was that that in addition to this, we have to understand that that this process can become conditioned, that your nervous system anticipates when you repetitively do something, it anticipates that you're going to do it. So if every morning you walk in and you take a cold shower for 2 minutes, before you ever stop and go into that shower, your nervous system is anticipating that you're going to do this. And it's changing your skin temperature in order to brace itself against this. The same thing is true as if you eat at the same time every day. Your nervous system is going to anticipate this, and it not only will anticipate it by getting your digestive system ready, it's going to anticipate about how much you're going to eat if you eat the same amount at every time every day. And so it's going to have about the appropriate amount of digestive process that is anticipating this. So it's going to turn out further that these anticipations, for example, for the cold shower, if you don't get into the cold shower, but it's expecting it, your nervous system is going to be rattled and you're going to get hot. Your skin temperature is going to be hot. You're going to be actually agitated, and in some fashion, you're going to be craving the cold shower because you've been expecting it. This is what happens when people exercise every day. For example, at the same time, they go for a run. We could call it addiction, but it's a very healthy addiction. But it's in fact the system is anticipating it, and people will get anxious and edgy and a little irritable if they aren't able to get to their daily run. So in the same way, people will wind up conditioning themselves to eating a bunch of this rich food, cramming it in at the end of their day. And when they do it consistently, they actually condition their minds to this. So after they're already full on healthy food, they literally start craving this other food. So that's what we talked about last time. So this is an extraordinary process. It's the classical conditioning of the CramCircuit. Now, you can see how close we are now getting to binge eating. It's starting to looking very much like binge eating. And you can see how close binge eating is to explaining bulimia, because all it takes is a person who's a little more bold and willing to vomit, and a little more determined to make sure that they're not overweight. So it doesn't take much. It's just moving the line over just a hair. So suddenly, when we understand, and of course, people that are bulimic are conditioned to the bulimia. So they are expecting to vomit. They're getting ready to vomit. And so when they are full, these cues are essentially almost ready to go. A lot of people will have this conditioning process happen. So people will drink a cup of coffee and then they'll go to the bathroom. Okay, that's there's some physiological reasons that drive that, but it's also conditioning. Sometimes all they need to do is smell the coffee and they're going to go to the bathroom. So conditioning plays a significant role in the establishment of and the maintenance of many patterns. Binge eating, bulimia, and cramming are all patterns that classical conditioning has a major hand in. So, and these three things are actually, you can see how related they are to each other. I think it's very interesting and potentially extremely useful to connect these dots together when we're trying to help people that are suffering from binge eating or bulimic disorders.
Very good. Well, thank you, Dr. Lisle. That was an excellent explanation. I actually learned a lot. There is another question also related to binging, and someone says, why does it seem that binging occurs most commonly in females, or is that not true?
You know, I don't know that that's true. So I think females may be more likely to seek help. Women are 80% of all psychotherapy patients. So it isn't that they've got 4 times as many problems as men. It's just that they're 4 times more likely to seek help. So I think that that could be what it is that we're seeing there. I've met an awful lot of men who are binge eaters. So I can't tell you that my experience has been that this is necessarily gender linked.
Right. I mean, I understand this question because, when we go to these health conferences, and you've been to many, I've been to many, and what do we see? Well, most of the attendees are women.
Sure.
And so, of course, and some of these women talk about binging. And so in my mind, I always, yes, it seems that it's mostly in women, but just because men seem to be absent.
Yes.
From that,
absent
activity.
From a lot of things.
From a lot of things. Watching the football game or something.
Okay. I'm not sure. I don't know that it's gender linked. So I wouldn't expect that it would be.
All right. Very good. So another question. If a person has a long history of binging, can it eventually affect the sensitivity of their stomach's stretch receptors so that they have a more difficult time telling if they are full?
That is a great question. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I believe that the answer is that in the long run, it will not. I don't think any situation like that would ever be permanent. I'm pretty sure that it wouldn't be permanent. The reason is is that at True North Health Center, we do long-term water fasting. And so we will have people that will fast for, 5 or 6 weeks. I know that sounds incredible, but we do. So it's not every year we have, a number of people that will go 40 days in our facility under our supervision of our doctors. They will go 40 days on water only. And so we've had many people who were major binge eaters undergo water fasts. And when you finish water fasting, there's a couple of things that are very dynamic and edgy. One of them is that when you begin to eat, you will feel full very, very quickly. So the stretch receptors, basically, maybe you have fasted for 10 days. Stretch receptors have not been stretched for 10 days. They're used to being stretched 3 or 4 times a day. And so they've gone quiet for quite a long time. Now we come back with a modest amount of food and people feel very full very quickly. So even people that are used to eating, enormous amounts of food because they're binge eaters, even when that happens, they will feel full very quickly. So this is telling me that the stretch receptor sensitivity is highly dynamic. Now, that might sound like checkmate for binge eating disorder, that this would be the way to go. I think it could be useful for water fasting, but I don't think it's necessarily the best solution in all cases. And the problem is that subsequent, after a water fast, after you begin refeeding for a while, what will happen sometimes is that you will be fascinated with food. So food is now hyper palatable. Even healthy food is extremely tasty post water fasting. And so once the stretch receptors get back online to a normal level, now we have a person who's running loose, even among healthy food, with a tongue and a palate that is very sensitive. And so people with a history of binge eating disorder can sometimes then go crazy even on whole natural food, and then the process can start all over again. So it's the answer to the question is, I do not believe that binge eating disorder will cause permanent changes in the sensitivity to the stretch receptor mechanism. But that doesn't mean that the reduced sensitivity in the middle of dealing with a binge disorder is trivial. I believe that when you are in the process, I believe it is very likely that the stretch receptors are less sensitive. And so therefore it adds difficulty to the battle because a binge eater isn't necessarily getting satiety signals at an appropriate time during, when they're in the middle of a binge process, time period in their life. So it requires some discipline to stop before one feels comfortable stopping, and to do that repeatedly. Essentially, it's kind of like stopping smoking. That we have to do this repeatedly many times in a row, even though it feels uncomfortable, and the system is still craving more food because it's expecting more. We have to be very diligent repeatedly, and as we do, we can extinguish the expectation in the system that it's going to get more food, and we can reestablish sensitivity in the stretch receptors, I am sure. I don't know that anybody's ever done any research on this, but it's logical that it would work this way. Clinically, this is exactly what it is that I see. And I see evidence of stretch receptor dynamics being actually quite reactive to the local learning history, its local history in water fasting. It doesn't take long for a water faster to become highly sensitive to small amounts of food. And that is true whether you have a binge history or not.
Yes, that's something I was going to ask you, and I thank you for already mentioning, but that I had heard people say that when they did a long water fasting, that they did become almost obsessed with food because everything tasted so good. Right. And so is that something that people that have a history of overeating or binging, maybe they have to be careful and ask questions when they go to the water fasting and be aware that could happen?
Oh, yes. That's why refeeding after a water fast is a very big deal.
Mm.
and you have to pay attention to what you're doing. You have to essentially ramp up slowly and carefully, and we have to look out for old patterns that could drag you right back into the trap that you just escaped. So it
Right.
can be an extremely useful strategy for many things, but it's not necessarily an easy checkmate. A lot of these behaviors, remember, are they are piggybacking on unbelievably powerful survival instincts. That's what the cram circuit is. And remember what the cram circuit is cramming. It's cramming rich foods. And remember why rich foods are important, because they're the best cost benefit ratio for the amount of calories per energy expended for the organism. So it has literally taste preferences woven into its dopamine system that basically say that's 500 calories a pound, therefore it's much more worth eating than that thing over there that's 200. And so when we start putting very rich foods around, even healthy foods, dates and raisins and things like that,
Mhm.
now that's 13 and 1400 calories a pound. Those are substantially more richer than meat, which is only at about 800. So you start to see that, and nuts are up at 2500. So you can see that whole natural foods, even that are healthy foods, that would have been rare and rich in the natural environment, can absolutely stoke cram behavior. And then we can condition that cram behavior in a way that our ancestors never would have, because you can do it repeatedly. Okay, so our ancestors crammed, but they only crammed once a month, once every 2 months. They didn't have the ability to cram night after night after night, and therefore set up a physiological expectation that this was going to happen, which results in cravings. And so this is the tricky trap that we have to add to the mess that we're looking at.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Another question, Dr. Lyle. Someone says, I have heard some people say that they binge on rice and sweet potatoes. I have a hard time believing them because these foods are so filling. Is it possible that they really aren't binging but just overeating a bit because these foods are of a much lower calorie density, that they simply need more food to feel full?
It's a very good question. The answer is there are some people that do, in fact, cram natural carbohydrates. And so it's not going to be common, but they do exist. And so we have to respect the fact that this happens. And it's not been common in my experience, but I have met several people where that's true. And so the problem that these people are facing is that for whatever reason, they're blowing past normal satiety mechanisms, even even with foods that are of only moderate calorie density. You can understand why this would be. So there's some people that like to get a little sun, and there's some people that like to get more sun, and then there's some people that are sun worshipers. So these are just individual differences in biology about how much certain people like certain things. I ran into somebody recently, I can't remember who it was, that loves the cold. I think they live in Fargo. I can't remember what the situation was, but I was astounded listening to them about how much they love the cold and the dark of the very north of the United States. Hey, fair enough. I've seen the last harsh winter I ever wanted to see. I had a whole bunch of them. I've lived in Idaho. I lived in Virginia. I've lived in cold places, and I'm no fan of that dark. The getting dark at 3:30 in the afternoon and being freezing cold. So, but this is somebody that loves that. So we have to understand that there's individual differences here, and there are people that that's enjoyment of even modest calorie dense foods like potatoes that are only 375 calories a pound. There are people that can blow right past normal satiety mechanisms and have the cram circuit activated on potatoes. And so their problem then is to understand that they've set up a conditioned cram circuit behind those potatoes. That's not normal hunger. That's a conditioned cram. classically conditioned cram. And so they need to then actually set reasonable parameters consistently over and over again and walk away. And so you can see now why certain programs out there in the world have had some success, even though their underlying logic is not particularly sound, like weighing and measuring. So weighing and measuring really doesn't make any sense from the standpoint of broad populations of animals of any kind, including humans. It makes no sense at all. However, in individual cases, you could see people still don't need to weigh and measure. They just simply need to understand that they have to set some reasonable parameter for how much they're going to eat. And then even though they are feeling a momentum to eat a lot more, they need to walk away. And they need to do it consistently so that they take themselves through a counter conditioning process and they extinguish the CramCircuit. They are not doomed to live with that uncertainty for their whole life. That's not what's happening. What we have is a temporarily conditioned CramCircuit, even to modest calorie density carbohydrate, and you have to put the stop to it. So essentially, the cramming is its own cigarette addiction, and we have to go through 2 or 3 weeks of stepping on its neck and not giving it its head, and so that we counter condition it. Then it becomes way easier, and the person can then just eat moderately, and the latent circuit is always there, and so it's important that people with that particular problem are very consistent. And if they ever indulge and go ahead and let a cram run away, then they're in danger of starting the whole thing over again. Just in the same way that a cigarette smoker, just moment of weakness, decides somebody offers them a cigarette and they take it. Well, at that point, they're in a lot of danger. They're now in turbulence because we now have a spontaneous recovery, and that's going to reverberate around their nervous system, and it's going to tease them for the next week or two. Very often they'll get hooked back again. Same thing with this sort of binge eating on cram eating on even healthy complex carbohydrates, so that if you can recover that circuit very easily, you can start to cram again. Then you're going to have to go through the same process again, where we actually have to step on it and hold still, essentially define what it is that you're going to eat. Once you eat it, you get up and walk away, and you never come back to that kitchen. And if we do that several nights in a row, we start to counter condition this thing, and now we're back in a good space where we're not having the problem.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned not being doomed for this, because that's exactly what I've heard a few people talk about after they heard your presentation. It's like, oh, well, I guess I'm doomed now to, this is just something that I'm born with or whatever, It's like, no.
Right. Yeah, that's good that we're getting this. That's why it's good to get these questions. Yes, you're not doomed. These are learning mechanisms, and they're very tricky learning mechanisms, and they're tenacious because they are the very mechanisms that were designed to keep your ancestors alive in an environment of scarcity. And so they're tenacious mechanisms, but it's also true. Think of some little ferret that comes by your door, or some stray cat that comes by your back door every day at about 5 or 6 o'clock, and you feed it. So you keep doing it and keep doing it, and then it's craving it, and then it's starting to feel like it needs to head over to your door, before the normal time, and it's howling at your back door. If you don't feed it, it's going to howl, and it's going to keep coming by there for a few days. But 2 weeks from now, it won't be coming by. That's because it's not worth the energy. So the system is designed elegantly to analyze cost-benefit opportunities. And that little stray cat, well, it's not a stray anyway. It's owned by the neighbors, and it's getting plenty of food. Okay? So the point is that it will not be coming by again for a long time. It will go in long stretches. Now, every once in a while, it's going to stop back over. That's called spontaneous recovery. Just go back and check and see if there's any food there. And if you feed it, trust me, it's going to be there tomorrow. Okay, so this is how this works. So think of this as your neighbor's cat, and that if you continue to feed your neighbor's cat, it's going to continue to show up and expect to be fed, and it's going to raise a fuss if you don't feed it. But if you don't feed it consistently and it keeps showing up and howling for a while, pretty soon, within a week or two, it's going to go away. And pretty soon, within a week or two, most cravings of most addictive processes go away. They don't completely go away, but they go away mostly. Now, if we have a really heavy duty supernormal drug that's more powerful than anything that's anywhere near normal, then the cravings can go on for a lot longer than that. Those are extremely dangerous substances. But most of everything that we are dealing with doesn't have that kind of thing. An exception might be a person who is struggling with alcohol, that they are genetically susceptible to alcoholism, which is about 1 in 20 people. And once they have classically conditioned an alcoholism into them, this is a fight. This is a very hard fight, and it's a harder fight than what it is that we're looking at here with food. It's several times more difficult. And if you hit a spontaneous recovery with that, and you indulge a spontaneous recovery, then you're in for some real turbulence. So alcoholism is very, very tricky, but it's the same process exactly. And so now I think all of us, looking at how hard we fight with food, we can really appreciate the very difficult and heroic process that people go through to beat any drug addiction of any kind. This is tough business, and so this is a warning to everybody that we need to be careful with pain medications. We need to be careful with anything that has, this addictive type of process, sleeping aids, anything like this. We need to be very respectful and very careful about the use of any such substances, because these traps are pretty tricky and they can be hard.
Yes. Well, again, thank you for mentioning that. Actually, I mean, people have to put some effort into getting out of this trap. I mean, it's not, we're not doomed, but we also have to, like you say, you have to set limits and walk away and things like that. Maybe actually this would lead to the next question that someone says, would you have any techniques on talking yourself out of eating uncontrollably or not compliant when you're hit by the CramCircuit?
Everybody's so different, so I can't give you a one size fits all.
You mentioned walking away, but is there any other?
One of them is to really change your routine. So let's suppose that after dinner you mill around and go watch TV. Well, the problem is if you go watch the same shows, that your nervous system is thinking, we're watching the same show we usually watch, so that means in about half an hour we're going to be cleaning out the soy ice cream that's in the freezer. So first of all, of course, it shouldn't be in the freezer, because rule number 1 for healthy living is that it's not there. But maybe it's not soy ice cream. Maybe it's almond butter and there's Ezekiel bread and there's honey in the cupboard. And you're thinking, that wouldn't be so bad. Nice peanut butter and honey sandwich. Since I have those almost every night, my nervous system is starting to crave them. It's getting prepared to get hit with that, so I'm starting to crave it. Now, that's why it's a good idea when we're trying to break out of these things, is to change our routine. So do something different. So I don't even care what it is, just make it different. Because what we're trying to do is break apart a learning chain. So if you usually go in and watch Seinfeld after dinner, don't do it. Change it up completely. Instead, go for a walk, or go up to your computer and look at Expedia about Hawaiian, trips to Hawaii that you aren't going to take. Something different. Essentially, distract yourself out of a normal routine. You will feel little midget waves of craving. They're not going to be strong. They're not super powerful. They're just insistent. And so it's important that we essentially defy them. And that's how we wind up counter conditioning a circuit like that.
Very good. Okay, thank you. I don't know how similar. This next question is, I'll let you decide, but there may be some overlapping. What is the best way to avoid a binge in the first place? Can one become binge proof?
You know, it's hard for a person who's asking that question to if they're a binge eater, there's they probably got it conditioned, and so they don't actually know how much easier they can get once they go through the counter conditioning process. So you cannot become binge proof because the cram circuit is a natural instinct that's in the system, and therefore it's going to motivate you to cram. And so, and then once you cram, you're going to recover. That's a spontaneous recovery of a learned circuit that you've already got now, because it's in you. This is kind of like people saying, will I ever get away from all these cravings of these things? No, you can get them quieter, but you now live in a land where you've tasted a bunch of stuff that is totally unnatural. Remember, folks, sugar and fat never come together in nature. They're never in the same bite. So sugar's going to be in fruit, and fat's going to be in either nuts or animal food, etc., and a few other things, maybe avocado. But you're not going to have sugar and fat in the same bite. So all you see around you is sugar and fat in the same bite. So these two different chemicals now that both independently activate the pleasure pathways have now been put in combinations, all sorts of combinations that we just consider normal. They're not normal. And so there are two different pathways simultaneously impacting the pleasure mechanism, the dopamine pathway. So they result in a supernormal stimulus. There's only supposed to be one light on you. It turns out there's two. And if you eat a Tony Roma's rib, it has all three. It has sugar, salt, and fat at the same time. Salt and fat aren't designed to rarely come together in any meaningful combination in nature. So we have an environment with unusual combinations, and because of those unusual and extremely pleasurable combinations, you remember those. You are no longer a virgin. You know what this is. And so those are in your memories, and we're not going to purge them from your memory banks. We can't do that. But it's going to turn out that they decay in your memory banks. In other words, you don't think about these things very often. They go very quiet the longer it's been since you had the experience. That's the nature of memory. And if you stoke them and you tease them every now and then they wake up. And so this is why the easiest solution for binge eating, for example, strangely enough, is to never do it. Now, the problem with that is that you've got a natural circuit, the cram circuit, that under certain conditions, it's going to be unbelievably enticing. It's going to say, here's the rich food. Oh, somebody made, even if it was really clean, somebody made a, ground nut shell, and then they put a bunch of rich fruit in there with coconut and something. And so they made some really fancy dessert, and it's theoretically legal. So there you are. So now what is it? It's not really legal because it's an unnatural combination of sugar and fat. And so it's a supernormal stimulus, even though it's made out of really healthy stuff. So here you are walking around with a latent, bulimia circuit, or essentially a latent binge eating circuit. And here you're faced with this thing. And you've got a cram circuit. You're full. You're pretty full. But now your little cram circuit says, go ahead and have some more. And then somebody says, oh, gee, I see you really like that, Pete. Why don't you have some more? There's plenty. So now you have a second chunk. Okay, now what are we doing? We are waking up. We are recovering our binge circuit, our conditioned cram circuit. So that means tomorrow it's expecting to have this. You just fed the cat. It hadn't been by in 3 months. It just came by and you said, poor little thing, looking a little thin. It's not thin. It's summer. Just lost some hair. Okay, but now what do? You feed it, and trust me, it's coming back tomorrow,
It's
and
coming.
it's going to be howling. So that's what you're up against. So you have to respect that these instincts, they're not evil, they're brilliant, and they are there to save your hide, and they save your order in our lives here, to see to it that we stay, we essentially quiet down the what is in fact pathological learning. That's what addiction is of any kind.
Mhm.
It's a pathological learning. The system is designed to learn, and it's designed to learn things that either keep it out of pain or move it towards pleasure. And so in this case, we're always talking about moving towards pleasure. So the system's designed to figure out how to get there, and it's designed to be really crafty about it. And the problem is the pleasures that we're facing aren't natural. And so that's what's making the learning of this pathological. So we have to understand that. And the way the learning works is essentially the better something's learned, the easier and easier and easier it gets to do. Okay. So if you're a bulimic and you've been a bulimic for a month, you're starting to learn how to be a bulimic. Now, 2 years from now, you're going to be a lot better at it. So your nervous system is going to be more honed and more sensitive and more ready to purge after you reach a certain level of fullness. The same thing is, now that doesn't mean that you're doomed. It just means that you're really well learned. So it means that we're going to have to really go through a counter conditioning period where we unwind the mess. And once we unwind the mess, we can't be confident. So I guess the question was, will you ever be free of this? No, you're not free of it, but you can keep it very quiet and very much under control. It is very possible for someone. I would say binge eating and cigarette smoking are probably pretty similar in terms of their tenacity. And so it's not easy. You've met many people never beat the cigarettes. They went all the way down with them. And yet you see that if they fight their way out, they can get out and stay out. So that's very similar to all of these problems. I think it's pretty much at about that level of intensity. The question is whether or not are people more likely to binge if they're eating rich, essentially unnatural food, as to eating more low calorie density foods? Yes, without a doubt. So the richer foods are going to be uh, uh, they're going to be much more reinforcing with every bite. This is why Lay's potato chip came up with a slogan that was absolutely right on target. Bet you can't eat just one. Now they don't have that for carrots, because you take one of those baby carrots and chew it up and eat it. It's like, how excited are you to eat another one? Maybe. Depends on how hungry you are. Depends on how sweet the carrot. Depends on how much you like carrots, but it's not unbelievably enticing. But one potato chip, hugely enticing, very reinforcing. We're getting an unnatural combination between the salt and the fat, and also, interestingly enough, the crunch. The crunch is an unusual texture experience that is probably piggybacking on a circuit that it was designed to test whether or not the food was crisp and ripe and excellent. So it's not unlike the first bite of an apple, or a bite through a carrot that is crisp. Similar process is taking place with the potato chip, except interestingly enough, you don't have to chew very hard. So you get this fantastical feeling that you've got something that's crisp, but you don't have to actually make much effort to chew it apart. And then of course you're very quickly reaching high salt and high fat. So this makes it extremely reinforcing. This is a work of genius, folks. Whoever invented that the first time knew that they had a trillion dollar idea. I mean, they didn't know how far it would go, but it would become a $1 trillion process. So yes, the answer is that it absolutely depends upon what types of food that you're eating is going to encouraging binging more or less. You can find individuals that will binge on low density healthy food. They're not common, but it's the same circuit. It's nothing bizarre about them. It's just they're just a little unusual. They're like sun worshipers. So they're worshiping, even the simple potato. That doesn't make them in any way pathological per se. It just makes them unusual. And it means that when there's all the potatoes that you want around them, then they can condition a CramCircuit just like we can condition a CramCircuit around ice cream or pizza or anything else. So most of the binge eating, if we look at it, mostly it has to do with rich foods because that's the easiest way to get that thing going, but it's not the only way.
Thank you again for being here today. And we'll see you.
Gustavo.
It's always a pleasure. Everybody loves every word that you say, and I appreciate it. And we'll see you hopefully next month.
Very good.
All right. Okay. Goodbye.